Thank you for joining us today on a new session of the GESI webinar series. Today's session is very exciting. We have a lineup of great presenters, and we have a lot of information to share with you. Let me first start by introducing the GESI webinar series. So the series serves as a platform for the GESI network members to share experience and expertise in evidence syntheses and to learn about potential collaborations. My name is Tamara Lutfi. I'm the coordinator for the GESI Secretariat, and I'll be moderating the session today. Before we start, just a few tips. If it's your first time using GoToWebinar, you are automatically muted as an attendee. If you had any question to send us, feel free to use the toolbar on the right to type in your question, or use the raise your hand button to be unmuted so that you can directly address the presenter that you want to discuss with. Now, before we start, let me thank Professor Sandy Oliver for organizing this webinar and making it possible. Today's session is on women's employment, synthesis, methods, and findings. We have Dr. Mukdarut Banpgan with us, Dr. Elizabeth Peters from Nduku, and Tamil Diaz. I'll start by introducing Dr. Mukdarut. Mukdarut is a senior lecturer at the EPPI-Centre, University College London. She has 14 years experience in systematic reviews and has worked with the UK Department for International Development and systematic reviewers around the world since 2010. After that, we'll have Dr. Elizabeth Peters, who is an Institute Fellow in the Center on Labor, Human Services and Population at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. She is a labor economist and demographer with more than 30 years of experience in social and family policy research. She received an MPP and Ph.D. in economics from University of Chicago. We also have Promise, who is a researcher at the EPPI-Centre for Evidence at the University of Johannesburg. His work entails conducting, supporting, and planning external and internal empirical research in relation to evidence-informed decision-making, including evidence syntheses, evidence networks, as well as mechanisms for evidence use. He holds a Master of Commerce and Development Economics degree from the University of Johannesburg. Last but not least, we have Tamil Diaz with us. Tamil is taking time out of her 8-year career in Brazil's Federal Civil Service to undertake a Master's in Social Policy and Social Research at University College London with a Chilnik Scholarship. She holds a master's degree in Development and International Cooperation from the University of Brasilia. Thank you all for joining us today. So we're starting with Mukdarut.
Thank you, Tamara, for the introduction. This is an exciting opportunity to discuss methods and findings from the two policy-relevant systematic reviews, which are looking at the evidence relating to women's economic empowerment. First of all, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues at EPPI-Centre, review teams, peer reviewers for providing support and advice for the program, and DFID for financial support for the program in the past 9 years. Briefly, this diagram presents the timeline of the DFID support group for systematic review programs, which was set up initially in 2010 as part of the broad DFID systematic review programs. The work that we are presenting today were commissioned by the EPPI-Centre support group in 2015, funded by DFID. Before that, the first call started in 2010, and the DFID program commissioned about 70 systematic reviews. In 2014, we also got the funding from DFID South Asia Research Hub to support the review teams in South Asia. So, talking about the support groups of this program, the review questions were largely developed from DFID, However, during the review process, we and the review teams had the opportunities to clarify and refine the question further. From our experience, policymakers' review questions tend to ask questions beyond what words. Very often they are multi-dimensional questions. The concept or outcome specified in the question, such as resilience, inequality, or sustainability, are often complex or context-specific. As a result, there are challenges in conducting reviews to address the policy questions. For example, they are likely to consider diverse types of evidence and employing a wide range of evidence synthesis approaches. So I am delighted to introduce our presenters today in this webinar, as we will hear from them about how they address these challenges in their work. So the first presenter, Liz, will be discussing what can be learned from the global qualitative literature to address the research question on women economic empowerment. Promise will be discussing what can be learned from global effectiveness literature on the similar topic. And Tamil will be discussing what can be learned from global systematic reviews and local evidence with particular reference to Brazil. So I am now handing over to Liz to start the discussion on her review.
Hi, I'm trying to get my screen up. I think is my screen showing now?
Not yet. Yep.
How about, okay, great. I really appreciate the opportunity to share the results of our systematic review on qualitative evidence on the barriers and facilitators of women's participation in high and growing productivity sectors in low and middle income countries. And I want to acknowledge my collaborators, Yasmin Irvin Erickson, Shirley Adelstein, Amar Malik, Teresa Derrick Mills, Alberto Valido, and Dorothy Esplage. The key question that we're asking is, what are the main barriers to and facilitators of women's employment in male-dominated sectors in low and middle income countries? And the specific objectives are to identify first the number and the characteristics of qualitative studies that address this key question, assess the quality of the literature, and summarize the findings. And to a limited degree, we're able to show how the findings differ for key subgroups of women. So first question is, why qualitative? What is it? What do we have to gain by looking at qualitative studies? Well, as you know, qualitative research is deeply contextual. And so this systematic review speaks to the aspects of social and economic experiences that just can't be captured in quantitative analysis. We end up with 18 studies that are focused on 3 sectors, both women in formal and informal work in the agricultural, trade, and mining sectors. And we're generally focused on women. The results that the studies we ended up with are focused on women who were very disadvantaged and often struggling to meet a subsistence level. Just so that you get the key findings up front, because I know the time is short. Our first finding is that gender norms create significant barriers to women's economic empowerment and their labor force participation, and those barriers are pervasive. There are direct effects that operate through influencing the roles that women are able to play, the social acceptability and perceptions of what are the appropriate roles to play at work and at home. And then there are indirect effects of gender norms that operate through actually affecting what resources women can access, the training, and other supports. The other factors that can affect women's empowerment, economic empowerment, are lack of social networks, lack of infrastructure and technology and education and training, and then explicit gender discrimination can also hold women back. And finally, our studies illuminated another mechanism that's really not necessarily directly targeted towards women, but nonetheless affects them disproportionately. That is certain global macroeconomic forces such as trade liberalization and the internationalization of the economy, and external events like war, conflict, environmental crises. And these factors can operate both as barriers and facilitators. So we start with an emergent framework which builds on our prior work. And this framework here, it differentiates between actionable barriers that are easier to change, and that's on the left, discrimination, a lack of, although that may also be harder to change, but we talk about examples of potential actions. So for discrimination, we could enact and enforce laws that prohibit discrimination. Other things like lack of limited access to infrastructure and technology, lack of education and training, lack of social networks, time burden. We also identify less malleable barriers, things like war and conflict, environmental crises, violence against women and girls. So drawing from the qualitative studies, as I said, we included illustrative examples of potential actions that could overcome the barriers and increase women's economic empowerment. And this framework, as you can see at the top with the arrows, also highlights what I mentioned about our key findings, the overall role of gender norms that were described in the vast majority of studies that we reviewed. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology. We had a two-phase design. The first phase was the pilot searches, where we set the initial question and looked at a limited number of academic databases and gray literature sources to scope the literature. And then we discussed these studies, titles and abstracts with our colleagues in DFID and the EPPI-Centre. And then in phase two, we searched much more extensively, expanding the academic databases and the gray literature sources to identify the qualitative and initially mixed method studies, looking at title and abstracts. We mapped the qualitative studies. And what I mean by mapping is we identified characteristics. We identified which studies fit our criteria, which did not, to narrow the number of studies that we needed to look at more deeply, and identified the characteristics of those studies. And then finally, as part of phase two, we appraised the quality of these studies. We made certain additional exclusions. In the end, we excluded upper middle income countries, mixed method studies, and low quality studies. We then appraised the quality of the studies that we ended up with in our review using a detailed tool, and we synthesized the findings. And then this flow chart just kind of looks at the process, identifying records through academic databases and through other sources in the gray literature. And then after removing duplicates, we ended up with 5,521 studies in the screening phase. We then looked at those at titles and abstracts and for relevance, and we ended up with 216 studies in the relevance phase that seemed to fit the criteria. Those we did some full text assessment, and we made some additional exclusions. We identified we excluded another 198 when we could see in the full text whether they fit better and they fit our criteria. And finally, we ended up with 18. Okay, to give you some of the characteristics of the included 18 studies, 11 were in commercial agriculture, 12 in trade, 4 in mining. These are more than 18 because some studies included multiple sectors. Very common were studies that looked both at commercial agriculture and then at trading of the products that were grown in the commercial agriculture sector. In terms of country classifications, about half were low income, half were low and middle income, and a couple of upper middle income studies did sneak in when they were in a paper that had multiple countries in it, where other countries were not upper middle income. Most of our countries were from Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa, 10, 6 from Asia, 2 from Latin America. And then you'll see the study outcomes that we looked at: wage employment, business ownership or self-employment, sometimes in the formal sector, but very often in the informal sector, and then other outcomes as well that you see on the screen. Okay, we used a framework synthesis to identify 6 analytic themes plus another category that's other that didn't fit into any of them. And they were derived initially from 18 a priori and emergent descriptive themes from coding the studies. And you'll see there that our themes, our analytic themes, are social norms, culture and laws. 15 studies address that. Access to resources, 14. Networks and organizations, 14. Technology, skills and education, 11. Global macro factors, 12. Unpaid care and women's poverty, 11, and then 9 for others. So I'm going to quickly try to get at the findings in my last 3 minutes. I'm going to go a little more detail on the gender norms, culture, and laws, because as I said, they emerged in most of the reviewed studies, in 15 of 18, as an important underlying factor in nearly all the barriers and facilitators. So as I mentioned, that gender norms influence the social acceptability, perceptions about the roles that men and women should play in society, and they can restrict women's economic opportunities by limiting their access to information and networks, sectors, and jobs and assets. It justifies gendered occupational segregation that tends to relegate women to jobs that are deemed less valuable, paying lower wages, and they're often cited to justify violence towards women and sexual harassment. On a brighter note, we also identified cases where gender roles were changing, sometimes in response to an external event that requires women to take on roles previously held by men. That can create a feedback loop where when women take on non-traditional roles, it can increase the social acceptability of that outcome. I'm going to just quickly go over a couple examples of our other themes, and I want to highlight some examples that really show the importance, the nuances that we can get from the qualitative data. So for example, networks and organizations, there's been a lot of work on developing formal cooperatives as one solution to empower women. And one of the things that we found in a couple of our studies is that that may be all well and good, and women would like to join those cooperatives, but they said that their husbands wouldn't let them participate because it wasn't consistent with their primary role in the home. So that's one example. In the technology training and business management skills area, one thing that we found was that there was sometimes less access to the agricultural extension agents, who tended to be male, because in some cultures, women were not allowed to interact with men who were not family members. So again, a resource that's provided that we think has a possibility to empower women, we're not able to fully realize that. And then the belief that men were better at technology. We found in one study that these grinder machines that were owned by women were operated by men because, quote, it was a general view that machines will last longer when men operate them because men's use of machinery is deemed normal. All right, and I'm going to skip these last two, but you can see them on the slides. Then just the contributions and limitations. We focus on the qualitative research, exploring the barriers and facilitators, and I'm just finishing up, that complements the quantitative systematic review that you're going to hear now, next. And we focus on a wide array of barriers that's broader in scope and more nuanced and deeper that's often possible from quantitative data, but that leads to conclusions that are exploratory rather than confirmatory. There's some limitations. It's reviews based on only 18 studies, focused on only 3 sectors. And so this review does not allow us to compare the efficacy of facilitators or the relative barriers for women in this study or women in other contexts. Instead, it provides grounding for future research and considerations for policy. Thank you.
Morris?
Yes, thank you so much. Just to quickly check if you can see my slides from your end before I continue with the presentation.
Not yet.
Okay.
Yes.
Is it visible now? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Tamara, for the introduction and for the facilitation of the presentation. And so I don't really want to waste a lot of time, given the time constraints. So just to carry on from where Liz left off, what I'm going to present is basically a systematic review that focused on the effectiveness and the design features of interventions to support women's participation in higher growth and or male-dominated sectors in low and middle-income countries, which was carried out by the wider ACE team. So what I'm basically going to be focusing on is mainly the findings, not so much about the methods and background. And then before I proceed, just to acknowledge the funders there, DFID and UCL. Right, so this is basically what you see is the review team, and I think here the only thing that I will mainly emphasize that if anyone wants more insight to look into the project, there's a diary that they can actually go to, and then the link is provided there to find out more about the project itself. And so in terms of the broader question of what we are trying to achieve, it was basically to review the available primary research evidence on programs and policies that aim to support women to participate in informal wage labor in low and middle income countries. And the idea was to focus on all global, on the available global evidence base. And in terms of the questions, in terms of the question itself, I think the key elements were actually to focus on effectiveness or the impact of the intervention, and also the design features. And in actual fact, there's actually 2 reports that we produced, as you can see from the slides there. There's a summary report and a technical report. So just to carry on. So how did we carry out this synthesis? The methods that we adopted is systematic review, and the type of review that we employed is firstly the quantitative systematic review to tease out what works. And in actual fact, this included counterfactual based impact evaluations. And we also adopted a two-stage approach with a prior evidence map, which I'm going to show you shortly, of the broader topic to refine the scope of the review. So this impact evaluation will form, as you can see, based on the picture, the primary studies or the seeds that will eventually lead us to the synthesis product itself. And in terms of the type of review synthesis, firstly is the statistical meta-analysis using weighted average effects based on numerical effect sizes of the primary studies, sorry, to establish causality. And then as a complementary process, we also carried out a qualitative comparative analysis to calculate the correlation of the different configurations of the design features with program effect. And in terms of development of the evidence base, so this is a flow diagram which just basically shows that initially we, in our searches, we found up around 15,619 studies, and also there were some additional sources there. So the records in total that were screened were around 16,000 in total. And like I said, we employed a two-stage process. So firstly was to produce an evidence map, and this included 501 studies that were assessed for eligibility. And in the final review, systematic review, there were 19 studies that were included there. And so moving from the evidence map of 501 studies to the 19 studies, the main reasons for exclusion at that stage were basically studies that were not looking at wage labor. For instance, women starting their own micro businesses, or they were not focused on the area of interest, which is basically high growth or male dominated sectors. And thirdly, also if it wasn't an impact evaluation design. So yeah, this is basically the evidence map, which is the first stage of the two-stage process. So what it basically did was to provide an overview of all the available evidence base on all impact evaluations that cover women's employment in this sector of interest. And important to note is that this evidence map was actually used to tailor the scope of the review to the most relevant evidence given the funders' priorities. For instance, narrowing to focus on wage employment rather than self-employment. So what I'm going to basically do for now is just to leave the slides and just quickly show you the evidence map that we produced. So this is evidence map on what works to increase female labor market participation in low and middle income countries. So it's actually quite a big map. And on the left-hand side is basically your interventions. And here on top, on the column side, we actually have your outcomes. And just to make use of one area of intersection, basically in this case, for instance, technical skills training that led to an outcome related to employment status. And what I can actually show you in this case is if we click on the bubble, then all the available evidence basically pops up with the article title and the authors as well. And I can also actually, if one has access to this map, you can actually click and you would have access to the abstract and the full text of the study of relevance within that bubble. So just to continue from where I left off here, like I said, so after we produced this evidence map, now we needed to narrow our focus based on the funders' priorities and the systematic review at 19 studies. So if we focus on these 19 studies, firstly, in terms of income country classification, you'd see the majority of these studies actually came from low to middle income countries, and three for each were coming from upper middle income countries as well as low income countries. And from a regional point of view, in actual fact, a majority, one would say, came from Asia, which had 6 studies, and 5 from Africa and Latin America, as well as 3 from Middle East. And there we just also provide the average age of the women that were in these 19 studies. And what also emerged from these 19 studies, that the locations in which these women resided would be further described as poor or very poor, or in actual fact disadvantaged, or more generally vulnerable. In summary, these interventions actually do not necessarily focus on the most vulnerable women per se, but focused on younger and more mobile women that one can argue that would have a higher chance of actually finding employment. And also, what was key in this process was to carry out an overall assessment of the quality of evidence. And in this case, we used the grade strength of evidence assessment, and we actually found out that overall there was a low quality of evidence, and also that only evidence on combined training and placement interventions allowed us to state synthesized findings with cautious level of confidence, which you're going to see shortly as well. So for all the other intervention categories, there is insufficient evidence to place confidence in these synthetic findings. So we have a higher level review findings. So how then, the next big question will be what then works? So as indicated earlier, that we delved based on the cautiousness of the strength of the overall assessment of the studies that we looked at. We could say the effects. We zoomed into the effects of training plus job placements on firstly employment as an outcome, and in actual fact, what we find out is that overall these interventions are found to work. From a numbers perspective, one would say 7.8 differences in changes in employment rates are in favor of the intervention group. And the other outcome based on this intervention of training and job placement that we looked at was actually income. And in this case, overall, again, these interventions are found to work, and 7.2% of these differences in the changes in income are actually in favor of the intervention group as well. So these are basically the high level findings that we had, and the next question will be, so how do they work? And to answer that question, we carried out a qualitative comparative analysis, and to look at the design features of these interventions. So we identified 7 design features of these interventions, and I will only focus on one example. Say if you look at the second design feature, which is labor demand-led intervention, example of the design feature will be actually consultation of private sector needs. And so after we identified these 7 intervention design features, what we also tried to do was to further unpack the specific configurations of these design features and their correlation with program effects. And just to quickly explain what's happening there, if you look at floor 2, where there is 2 studies based on the number of configurations there, in that case, would say those 2 studies met our criterion for consistency, and these configurations, the configuration in that case actually indicates that in all 7 design features, if all 7 design features are present, then the interventions are likely to be effective. And the general conclusion from this is that the QCA in actual fact is inconclusive, as no configuration of studies is associated consistently with higher effects. And yeah, this brings me to the end of the presentation. And in conclusion, what we actually found or identified is that there's a small evidence base that is heterogeneous in terms of applied labor market interventions. And in actual fact, it is of low quality in terms of methodological trustworthiness. trustworthiness of the studies, and also the consistency of effects. And given the limitations of this evidence base, our review only identified a single intervention grouping in which we could conduct a rigorous synthesis, which was basically combined training and job placement interventions that had an impact on, firstly, we looked at employment and then also income outcomes. And then our meta-analysis provides cautious evidence that combined training and job placement interventions are an effective approach to increasing women's labor participation in higher growth or male-dominated sectors in low and middle income countries. And also in terms of the design features from the QCA suggest that we draw on demand-led and norms-led approaches as well as behavioral insights to promote women's wage labor participation in the sector of interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tamara. Yes?
It's great.
It's working? Okay. Thank you, Tamara, for the introduction, and a big thanks for Sandy Oliver for inviting me for this amazing opportunity. I'll be presenting today the main results and discussions that came out of my master's dissertation in social policy and social research here in the Institute of Education, UCL. So Sandy was and is my kind and very supportive supervisor. And when we were discussing potential topics for my dissertation, she presented me the two systematic reviews, both previously presented today. So after taking a good look at them, I asked myself if that body of evidence could be a good fit for the Brazilian context. Could I somehow transfer that global evidence for the Brazilian setting? This question came out of years of practice working in the Brazilian federal government, where I worked closely with the design and formulation of social policies. So the use of evidence to inform decision-making has been widely discussed in Brazilian public administration, but there are several constraints that still hinders the link between evidence and policymaker, such as budget limitation to fund research, timing between decision and the final research report, lack of governance between stakeholders, and so on. So in that sense, I was wondering if transferring evidence could be a good solution then. If the evidence synthesis is already there, published, then why not use them in my local setting? Would that be reasonable? So this is my main objective in this study, to investigate the feasibility of using evidence from similar contexts to design a set of recommendations for policy in another local setting. In this case, using the case of women's employment in male-dominated sectors in Brazil. For that, my base of global evidence about the topic are the two systematic reviews from Langer and colleagues and Peters and colleagues. But then how do we know if the global evidence is a good fit for Brazil? So how can we draw local policy recommendations just based on the global evidence? To answer this question, I conducted a rapid review to synthesize the local knowledge, which means those studies not included in the global reviews because they were written in Portuguese or Spanish. So after taking a look at this whole body of global and local evidence, the purpose of this research is also, obviously, to develop policy discussion and policy recommendations. So for that, it was necessary to search locally what are the main barriers and facilitators for women in male-dominated sectors, occupations, and positions in Brazil. And these are my rapid review questions. So here is a general overview of what I just described, the research rationale. We have them two published systematic reviews out there. And the question is, can I use this evidence to inform my decision maker back home? The outcome of the combination of this evidence, both from the global systematic reviews and from my own local rapid review, is the policy recommendation. So presenting the topic just briefly is very well known as a global problem. Labor markets are gender segregated. So here we are talking about two types of segregation, horizontal and vertical segregation. I'm gonna skip this because I know I'm running out of time. So before showing you my findings, what defines male-dominated sectors in Brazil? That was my first question. And that was the first information I needed to start for doing searches locally. So I ran this descriptive table based on the main database for formal wage employment in Brazil, and ordered the sectors by female participation. So you can see the third column. Those sectors that are higher in the table are those that have more proportion of women. This was the first adaptation needed to be made, because both Peters and Langer's studies, they use different sectors in their reviews. And here's the first very basic finding. Sectors are different because countries are macroeconomically different. Just quickly again, some relevant working concepts, the big words I've been using, and the references in case you want to look for them. What I want to highlight here is how we set a method for judging the fit of evidence. So the literature about external validity is extensive in ranking experimental design studies on that. But what matters the most for the decision maker? The fit to local context or the rigor, statistical fidelity? Just keep that in mind. Again, just quickly showing you a bit of my methods to conduct a rapid review. The eligibility criteria were very similar to the global reviews, but exclusively to Brazilian women. The review questions needed to be a bit broader because the pilot search reviewed very few quantitative studies, and there was another adaptation needed. You can see here the flow chart of the screening and the inclusion. So in the end, it was included in the rapid review 21 studies. And here you can see the features of this 21 included studies. Only 2 of them were about an intervention called Pro-Equity Program. The majority of the studies is qualitative research published in journal articles. Most of them use interviews, and almost all of them are very, very descriptive. So no causal relations. We can also see the sector's distribution in the right. And I found lots of studies about business women and the glass ceiling, which was very interesting. So let's jump to the rapid review findings. To come to this summary of findings, it's important to quickly describe the coding process. It was created analytical themes based on the 2 global reviews. And when extracting and coding, some things were novelty or slightly different for Brazilian studies. So I had to adapt them. So I split the themes into barriers and facilitators following Elizabeth's logic. A thematic synthesis was used to structure summaries and bring the findings together. The synthesis identified 3 main topics about barriers covered by the studies. As you can see, discrimination, lack of social capital, unbalanced family and work life. And unbalanced family and work life showed to be transversal and perpetrator of other barriers. In practice, time conflict restricts more extensive working opportunities. There are remaining stereotypes based on traditional gender roles that end up also causing many barriers such as discrimination and horizontal segregation. These traditional gender roles are part of cultural structures and therefore are less malleable and take a long time to change, as Elizabeth already stated. The facilitators identify strategies that have been helping women that work in male-dominated sectors. Those facilitators were often due to private support to informal networks, such as families, communities, or paid domestic workers. That's very specific for Brazil. And also is noticed the role that private sector has developed undertaking measures by them own, so companies running voluntary interventions. So here's what we are interested, the comparison of global evidence with Brazilian evidence. So after the synthesis and analysis of the rapid review findings about Brazil, the next step was to compare those findings with the global reviews. So here's an extract of the table. It's just a sample of the whole one, just to fit this slide. You can see the first column presents the reviewed intervention by Lange et al. And the second column of this table is the information if the issue was addressed by any of the studies included in the rapid review of Brazilian studies. In the third column, it is the judgment of a potential fit for the Brazilian context based on the rapid review findings. And also based on the general literature I had to read, and also based on my expertise in the Brazilian policy context. What is important to see here is that even though the rapid review did not bring any effectiveness evaluation, the applicability of the Lange and colleagues review about intervention can still be discussed, because the objective here was not comparing quality of evidence, but to find fit for the context. So it's more of an interpretation than a measure of comparison. For example, in the first line, combined training with placement services, although not discussed by any of the reviewed studies in the rapid review, it's an intervention design that could fit very well the Brazilian context. Similarly, in Elizabeth and colleagues' review, I also selected a extract of the table to show different results in terms of fitness. It follows the same logic. Just some examples. Since women and men are legally equal in Brazil, there is no formal barriers to access resources, for example. However, that appears as an outcome of other barriers, for instance, the lack of social capital. You can see in the second line. Another instance of poor fit is education. Women are actually more educated than men in Brazil. Despite having more years of education, they still earn less, still segregated, and so on. So finally, gender norms and unpaid care were those findings that most fit the Brazilian context. All 21 reviewed studies mentioned those issues. After looking at those three bodies of evidence, another synthesis done was regarding to policy recommendations. And that is the last big table, I promise. In this table, I summarize the recommendations addressed by the three reviews, and also I judge in which stage or what is the current situation about that policy or that issue in Brazil. It's the last column. This would be the outcome of the combination of the three reviews in order to actually inform the policy process. The recommendations bring all three bodies of evidence together. So discussing the strengths and potentialities, trying to wrap up a bit the discussion around the comparison of global evidence with the Brazilian one, we can point out that the rapid review brings comprehension to what could work better. It brings useful local information combined with those from Lange and Peters and colleagues that permits to deepen our understanding about gender segregated labor market in Brazil, and therefore shed light on what kind of policy would be needed. In that sense, the rapid review is a supplement for the local fit of the global evidence. Transferring evidence from a systematic review to a local context is a useful tool, but for different parts of the policy cycle. The combined evidence provides a general overview of the topic that can inform agenda setting, for example, or help on setting priorities, strategies to engage policy actors. So it's important to have the whole policy process in mind, not only design or evaluation, and also bearing the diversity of actors that can use the evidence to shape policy, not only governments. In this case, I would highlight employers and workers and their representative organizations. However, there are limitations. Adopting the global evidence without considering the local information could have been problematic, as we saw in some of the examples. The reviewed studies presented a wide variety of scope, objectives, methods, techniques, population, sectors, localizations, everything very heterogeneous. The diversity of information presented a challenging task on synthesizing the findings, as you can imagine. And the most important, transferring social research evidence needs caution. The analyzed case showed that historical and cultural determinants are essentially shapers of gender issues and differ greatly between countries, which makes the task of transferring evidence of high risk of bias and inaccuracy. To conclude, is then transferability one possible facilitator for the use of evidence constraints in low and middle income countries? Well, it is useful for agenda setting, for monitoring, for stakeholders engagement, for policy learning, and also policy transfer. As you saw, the tool has great potential, but the levels of methodological sophistication required to draw accurate transferability of evidence, and here I'm mostly talking about in terms of rigor on external validity, might be overwhelming to localities that lacks capacity to uptake evidence from research. So we're back to stage one. So finally, we see transferability as a tool for policy learning. I really like this policy learning term. And an important research gap we spotted is the need to further develop guidance and proper methods for transferring and adapting social research evidence. Here, a big emphasis on the social research kind of data. The production of rapid review, however, showed to be a useful resource for providing contextualized and targeted information to a tailored policy issue. Here are the references I mentioned in the slides, and here are my contacts. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tamil and Promise and Elizabeth and Mukdarut for the great sessions and great slides. So I'm afraid we don't have a lot of time left for questions, but let's start. So do we have any questions from our attendees or any particular comment or even a discussion point that you'd like to raise? Please feel free to send them on the right using the questions panel or by using the raise your hand button so that we give you an opportunity to directly ask your question or make a comment to our presenters. Okay, so hello. So we'll have Fatullah Shimenda, sorry, not Shimendaba. Hello, can you hear us?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. My question is here for Tamila Dice.
Please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead with your question.
Okay, thank you very much for all the very interesting presentations. I very much enjoyed all of the presentations, and I specifically enjoyed the ones by Tamila. And it seems to me that it exactly spoke about my situation at home, which I want to highlight is about unpaid employment and the time poverty issue. And I just want to congratulate her about the whole experience, and I just want to relate to the experience. That's about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us for the session and for making this comment. And feel free to contact Tamila at any point for further discussions.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Christian with us.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Great. So I would like just to congratulate like the presentation. They were very clear and very good on how they answered the specific questions that they had. So my specific question would be for Tamil as well. I'm very particularly interested in the Brazilian case because I'm also from Chile, from Latin America, and we share something that it's very, let's say, a characteristic of Latin America and also in South Africa probably, that we are a very unequal countries. So it's very interesting on how the findings of the previous reviews were applied to the specific Brazilian context. And I also would like to ask her if she also had that perspective on mind when she was applying the findings there and on the specific findings of the rapid review. So how the unequal context of Brazil could have affected the applicability, the transferability, and the generalizability of the results of the previous review and the result of the rapid review itself.
Tamara, can I
Yes.
answer?
Yes, Tamil, please go ahead.
Thank you, Christian, for your question. Yes, inequalities are a huge feature of our continent, and yes, they were in the rapid review. So one of the codes I used that I didn't see in the reviews of Langers and Peters is the intersectional feature, because intersectionality in Brazil is very important to labor market. So I'm talking here about gender and also race and ethnicity. And some of the studies address this issue, and some of the studies also address region inequalities, because Brazil is such a huge and diverse country. So we have the south richer region, and we have the north and the northeast, the poorest parts of the country. So how can we even talk about generalizability, that's a big word, and adaptability if inside the country you have a wide variety of inequalities? So yeah, that's really important, and I tried to address that in my rapid review. That was the part of what I'm calling the novelty, because for the Brazilian context, and specifically for the context of the Brazilian labor market, structural inequalities are very, very important. But that's also a limitation. Synthesizing the evidence, sometimes this information can be addressed in terms of policy recommendation, but they cannot be seen as a general information. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I totally does. Thank you.